Welcome back, Wasteland Wanderers, to another journey through the darkest corners of Fallout's pre-war history. Tonight, we're diving deep into the military machine that consumed America in its final years, the power armor divisions, nuclear forces, and occupation armies that seemed invincible right up until the moment they vaporized on October 23rd, 2077. Well, explore the organization, technology, and terrible human cost of the military-industrial complex that helped ensure when civilization fell, it took the entire world with it. The smell of ozone and machine oil hangs in the memory of the old world, clinging to the rusted hulks of power armor that still dot the Commonwealth landscape like tombstones of America's final military might. Before the bombs fell, before the sirens wailed their last warning on October 23rd, the United States military had transformed into something both magnificent and monstrous, a fusion of pre-war optimism and desperate militarization that would define the last gasping years of civilization. The story of that transformation begins not with politicians or generals, but with the metallic footfalls of armored soldiers marching through frozen tundra, their every step a testament to how far America would go to secure its future, even as that future crumbled around them. The T-45 power armor made its combat debut in the Alaskan theater in the winter of 2067, and those first soldiers who climbed into the bulky exoskeletons described a sensation unlike anything in military history. The hydraulic servos engaged with a whine that you could feel through your entire skeleton, a vibration that started in your boots and traveled up through your spine until your teeth chattered with the machine's power. The armor smelled of fresh paint and heated metal, of the special lubricants that kept joints moving in temperatures that would freeze a man solid in minutes. Inside the helmet, your breath fogged the display for just a moment before the environmental systems kicked in, replacing the stale air with the sterile, recycled atmosphere that would become more familiar than natural breathing. The weight of the armor should have been crushing nearly 1,000 pounds of steel and ceramics, but the fusion-powered servos distributed it so perfectly that soldiers reported feeling weightless, godlike, invincible against the Chinese forces dug into Anchorage like ticks on America's northern frontier. The 108th Infantry Regiment became the proving ground for this new form of warfare, and General Constantine Chase understood that he wasn't just commanding soldiers anymore, but orchestrating a new kind of combat that merged man and machine into something the old training manuals had never anticipated. Chase was a West Point graduate who'd cut his teeth in the resource wars, watching American forces deploy across 3 continents to secure oil, uranium, and the rare earth elements that kept the pre-war world spinning. Had seen conventional warfare fail against entrenched Chinese positions in Anchorage, watched good men freeze to death in their foxholes while enemy artillery turned the snow red. The arrival of the T-45 units changed everything, though the early models were far from the sleek killing machines that propaganda posters would later depict. They were crude, prone to servo lockups in extreme cold, and their fusion cores lasted barely 6 hours under combat conditions before needing replacement. The maintenance battalions that supported the power armor divisions numbered nearly 3 support personnel for every armored soldier, a logistical nightmare that the Pentagon tried desperately to keep from public knowledge. These men and women worked in heated tents behind the lines, their hands stained with hydraulic fluid and their lungs full of the acrid smoke from welding torches that ran 20 hours a day. They learned to swap fusion cores in under 4 minutes, working with materials so radioactive that their dosimeters clicked constantly, each tick a small surrender of lifespan in service of keeping the armored infantry operational. The cores themselves came through a supply chain that stretched from Mass Fusion's reactor facilities in Cambridge through Canadian territory held under military occupation and finally to forward operating bases, where they were stored in lead-lined bunkers that hummed with barely contained atomic energy. The Chinese Dragoons, elite commandos equipped with their own stealth suits and crimson-painted armor, learned to fear the sound of American power armor on the move. It wasn't a quiet approach. The servos whined, the fusion packs hummed their deadly song, and the ground itself seemed to shake under their weight. But that terror was the point. Psychological warfare divisions had calculated that the mere presence of power-armored units reduced enemy morale by 37% before the first shot was fired. The dragoons adapted setting traps in ice fields where the armor's weight would send soldiers plunging through to the frozen water below, targeting fusion cores with armor-piercing rounds that could turn an invincible soldier into a walking bomb. The battles along the Anchorage front line became a deadly game of adaptation and counter-adaptation, each side pushing technology and tactics to their absolute limits. By the time the T-51B entered service in 2076, the military had learned from Alaska's harsh lessons. The new armor represented the pinnacle of pre-war engineering, a masterpiece of West Tech innovation that integrated polymer composite plating from Cambridge Polymer Labs with energy weapon capabilities developed in classified programs at Fort Strong. The suit fit like a second skin rather than a mechanical coffin, its actuators responding to muscle movements with such precision that soldiers claimed they forgot they were wearing armor at all. The smell inside was different too, less machine oil, more of the sharp ozone scent of the advanced sensor packages and the faint radiation signature of the more efficient fusion cores that could run for nearly 24 hours under combat load. Elite units, equipped with T-51B armor, became the tip of the spear for American military operations, deployed not just in Alaska, but in the nightmarish mainland China campaign that would consume the final years before the bombs. The Yangtze deployment remains one of the most classified operations in pre-war military history, but fragments of the truth can be pieced together from scattered terminal entries and the desperate accounts of soldiers who never made it home. American forces pushed deep into Chinese territory in 2077, mechanized divisions supported by power armor units rolling through cities that had been reduced to radioactive ruins by tactical nuclear exchanges. The troops wore their armor constantly sleeping in it when they slept at all, the suits recycling their sweat and waste in closed-loop systems that made each soldier a self-contained biological unit. They described the taste of recycled water metallic and flat, and the way your own smell would build up inside the suit until it became a constant companion, a reminder that for all the armor's power, you were still human inside, still vulnerable to the psychological weight of what was being done in America's name. The Navy's ballistic missile submarine fleet prowled the depths of the Atlantic and Pacific, each vessel a floating nuclear arsenal, carrying enough firepower to erase entire nations from existence. The submarine service attracted a particular kind of soldier, men and women, willing to spend months in the crushing darkness of the deep ocean breathing recycled air that always carried the faint metallic tang of the carbon dioxide scrubbers. The boomers, as they were called, maintained launch protocols that required 3 separate authorization codes to fire their missiles, a system designed to prevent accidental apocalypse that would fail spectacularly when October 23rd rolled around. Each submarine carried 24 missiles, each missile carried multiple independently targetable warheads, and the mathematics of mutual assured destruction had been calculated down to the last kiloton needed to ensure no enemy city would survive retaliation. The intercontinental ballistic missile silo network stretched across the American heartland like a constellation of death, buried deep beneath farmland where families lived their lives unaware that beneath their feet sat weapons capable of ending human civilization. The launch crews rotated on 8-hour shifts, 2 officers sealed in underground bunkers with walls thick enough to survive near-miss nuclear strikes. They practiced launch procedures until the sequence became muscle memory. Insert key, turn on commanders, mark verify target package, initiate launch sequence. The silos themselves were marvels of engineering designed to withstand everything except a direct hit. Their blast doors weighing hundreds of tons and their missile tubes reaching down into the earth like the fingers of some buried god. On October 23rd, when the authorization came through, the crews followed their training perfectly, and the missiles rose from their silos, trailing fire and thunder, carrying their payloads toward targets that would be launching their own weapons in return. The Canadian annexation had begun as a military necessity and ended as an occupation that consumed entire divisions of American forces. When the resource wars made securing petroleum supplies a matter of national survival, and when the Alaskan pipeline needed protection through Canadian territory, the United States had simply taken what it needed. The official story spoke of mutual defense agreements and willing partnership, but the soldiers deployed to occupation duty knew better. They patrolled cities where English and French graffiti cursed American imperialism, where resistance fighters set bombs in marketplaces and took potshots at convoys rolling north with supplies for the Anchorage front. The occupation forces, numbered in the hundreds of thousands by 2076, a sprawling network of military governance that stretched from Vancouver to Montreal, enforcing martial law with the same power armor technology that had proven so effective in Alaska. Resistance suppression units developed tactics specifically for urban counterinsurgency, learning to clear buildings room by room while watching for improvised explosives and sniper fire. The soldiers spoke in hushed tones about the orders they'd received, the rules of engagement that seemed to expand with each new attack until almost any Canadian civilian could be designated a potential threat. The military governance structure operated parallel to whatever remained of Canadian civil authority, with American colonels and generals making decisions about resource allocation, curfew enforcement, and the brutal suppression of dissent. Execution squads dealt with confirmed insurgents, and the definition of insurgent grew broader as the war dragged on and American patience wore thin. Some soldiers kept journals documenting their growing horror at what they were ordered to do, but most simply followed orders and tried not to think too hard about the taste of ash in their mouths or the way their hands shook after particularly brutal operations. The domestic situation deteriorated in parallel with foreign wars, and the military found itself increasingly deployed on American soil to maintain order as food riots spread and quarantine zones expanded around areas contaminated by industrial accidents and biological weapon tests gone wrong. The National Guard had been the first line of domestic defense state militias called up to patrol their own communities, but as the crisis deepened, these units were federalized and absorbed into the regular military structure. Soldiers from the 101st Airborne found themselves manning checkpoints in Detroit, while power-armored units from Fort Strong deployed to Boston to suppress protests over food rationing. The transition from protector to oppressor happened gradually, each new emergency order making the unthinkable seem necessary, each deployment against American citizens eroding the lines that had once separated military from police functions. Desertion became an epidemic by 2077, with entire units disappearing into the chaos of civilian life rather than follow orders to fire on protesters or enforce quarantine perimeters with lethal force. The military police created specialized desertion execution squads teams tasked with hunting down AWOL soldiers and making examples of them. Terminal entries from Fort Strong describe summary executions carried out in public squares, bodies left hanging as warnings to anyone else considering abandonment of duty. The legal frameworks that had once protected soldiers' rights had been suspended under Emergency Powers Acts, leaving military justice as arbitrary as a commander's mood and political reliability more important than competence or morality. If you're still with me after hearing this, hit that like and subscribe button. The Special Forces community operated in shadows even darker than the classified programs that birthed the power armor divisions, and their operations remain fragmentary nightmares pieced together from redacted documents and the occasional survivor's account. Navy SEALs conducted deep penetration missions into Chinese coastal facilities, inserting from submarines in the dead of night to sabotage nuclear installations and assassinate military commanders. These operators trained in conditions that would break ordinary soldiers. Weeks submerged in frigid water sleep deprivation that pushed men to hallucination, exposure to chemical agents that tested the limits of pre-war protective equipment. They described the peculiar sensation of swimming through radioactive water around enemy installations, the way your skin would tingle and burn even through the wetsuit. The knowledge that each mission was shaving years off your life expectancy, accumulating in your bone marrow and soft tissues. Army Rangers deployed to every theater where American interests demanded projection of force, from the irradiated battlefields of the Gobi Desert to the oil fields of the Middle East that had sparked the resource wars. Their training emphasized the brutal efficiency of close-quarters combat, the kind of fighting that happened when power armor wasn't available or practical, when you needed soldiers who could move silent through enemy territory and kill with hands blades or suppressed weapons that wouldn't wake the compound you were infiltrating. The Rangers kept their own oral history stories passed from veteran to rookie about operations so classified that even acknowledging their existence would mean court-martial. They spoke of missions into the European Commonwealth as it tore itself apart, of securing nuclear materials from fractured nations, of eliminating scientists and engineers before they could sell their knowledge to the highest bidder, in a world where desperation had made every moral boundary negotiable. Marine Force Recon operated at the bleeding edge of the Sino-American War, conducting reconnaissance missions that provided targeting data for nuclear strikes and conventional bombardment. These Marines spent weeks behind enemy lines, living off the land in territories so contaminated that their Geiger counters never stopped clicking, eating rations that tasted like cardboard and chemicals while watching Chinese troop movements through optics that seemed to magnify not just images but the crushing weight of what they were witnessing. They called in airstrikes on civilian population centers that had been converted to military staging areas, watched the flash of tactical nuclear weapons turn night into artificial day, and counted the dead in numbers that stopped having meaning somewhere around the 10,000 mark. The psychological warfare divisions studied these operators carefully, noting the rates of mental breakdown and developing protocols for managing combat stress that mostly involved rotating traumatized soldiers back to equally horrific assignments rather than actually treating their wounds. Fort Strong had been an ordinary military installation before West Tech's contracts transformed it into something else entirely, a weapons testing facility where the boundaries between scientific research and atrocity grew increasingly blurred. The fort's underground laboratories stretched deep into the earth levels, upon levels of reinforced concrete and lead shielding, where civilian contractors and military scientists worked on projects that ranged from improved rifle designs to biological weapons that would make the plague look merciful. Soldiers assigned to Fort Strong security learned not to ask questions about the screaming that sometimes echoed from the lower levels, about the disposal teams that would emerge in full contamination suits to incinerate something in the facility's massive furnaces. The base commander maintained detailed logs of experimental weapons tests, carefully documenting the lethality of each new innovation, while the bodies of test subjects, officially listed as volunteers though everyone knew better, were cremated and their ashes scattered in the Atlantic. Cambridge Polymer Labs had begun as a corporate research facility focused on creating better plastics for consumer goods, but military contracts redirected their expertise toward developing the composite materials that would make the T-51B possible. The lab's pristine white corridors and sterile air filtration systems created an environment utterly divorced from the battlefield chaos where their creations would be deployed. Scientists there worked with polymers that could stop armor-piercing rounds while weighing less than steel, with ablative coatings that could dissipate laser weapons and heat from plasma fire. They tested their materials by shooting them, burning them, exposing them to radiation doses that would kill a person in seconds, all while maintaining meticulous records and receiving military commendations for innovations that would be deployed to kill more efficiently. The line between defensive technology and enabling carnage was one these scientists stopped seeing somewhere around the time their paychecks started clearing. Mass fusion had built an empire on the promise of limitless atomic energy, but their military contracts told a different story about where fusion technology really flourished. The energy weapons programs produced laser rifles that could cut through power armor, plasma weapons that reduced human beings to puddles of irradiated organic slurry, and the miniaturized fusion cores that powered both weapons and armor. The corporation's executive suites in downtown Boston offered panoramic views of the city, while deep below in their reactor facilities, workers were exposed to radiation levels that would guarantee cancer within a decade. The fusion cores themselves were small miracles of engineering containing nuclear reactions hot enough to power a suit of armor for a full day while remaining compact enough to be swapped in combat conditions. They were also catastrophically dangerous. A core breaching under fire would vaporize everything in a 20-foot radius, a fact that soldiers learned to exploit by targeting enemy armors, power supplies, and watching the resulting detonations. Big Mountain and its shadowy experiments existed beyond the reach of congressional oversight or public accountability, a research facility where the military-industrial complex pursued projects too disturbing even for Fort Strong's classified programs. The fragments of information that survived suggest research into brain extraction and preservation, into cybernetic enhancement that treated human consciousness as just another component to be optimized and upgraded. Soldiers who'd been selected for special programs at Big Mountain rarely spoke of their experiences, and those who did described procedures performed without anesthesia of being conscious, while portions of their brain were mapped and modified of waking up, changed in ways they couldn't articulate but could feel in every thought and dream. The facility's official designation was a simple number in the military's vast bureaucratic machine, but those who knew called it by other names, whispered curses that reflected what happened when scientific curiosity was freed from ethical constraint and fed unlimited funding. The Pentagon's command structure in the final years before the bombs had evolved into something Byzantine and compartmentalized, with the Joint Chiefs of Staff presiding over a military machine so vast that no single person could comprehend its full scope. The building itself was a monument to American military might, 5 concentric rings of offices and corridors where hundreds of thousands of personnel moved like blood cells through arteries of institutional power. In the deepest sections behind vault doors and biometric scanners, the continuity of government plans were being finalized. These weren't the public civil defense programs with their cheerful duck and cover, educational films, and reassuring lies about survival. These were the real plans, the protocols for ensuring that some fragment of American government would survive total nuclear war, that command and control would persist even as the surface world burned. DEFCON protocols had been established during the Cold War, but by 2077, they'd been refined into a hair-trigger system where humanity's survival depended on the restraint of officers who'd been trained to follow orders without question. The progression from DEFCON 5 to DEFCON 1 happened with terrifying speed in the final days, each elevation bringing American nuclear forces closer to launch readiness. At DEFCON, 2 bomber crews slept in their aircraft. Submarine captains brought their vessels to launch depth, and intercontinental ballistic missile crews sat at their consoles with keys already inserted, waiting only for the final authorization codes. NORAD integration meant that every radar blip, every satellite detection, every potential threat was processed through systems designed to provide warning of incoming attack, while the clocks counted down the minutes humanity had left to make decisions that would determine whether civilization survived. The Enclave's formation remains murky, lost in layers of classification that may have been destroyed in the nuclear fire or deliberately obscured even before the bombs fell. What's clear is that elements within the military and government had been preparing for the apocalypse, not as a possibility to prevent, but as an inevitability to survive. Deep bunkers were constructed and stocked genetic materials, preserved weapons and technology, cached in locations that only a select few knew about. These weren't the public vaults that Vault Tech marketed to an anxious population, but private sanctuaries for those deemed essential to rebuilding American power in whatever world emerged from the ashes. The officers and officials selected for these programs were chosen for ideological purity as much as competence screened for absolute loyalty to a vision of America that would transcend mere national survival and become something harder, colder, more willing to do whatever proved necessary. The resource wars had begun in the 2050s as Europe and the Middle East tore themselves apart over diminishing petroleum supplies, and American military forces had deployed globally to secure access to the resources that kept pre-war civilization functioning. These weren't peacekeeping missions or humanitarian interventions, but naked resource extraction protected by overwhelming military force. American soldiers patrolled oil fields in territories where local populations had been cleared away, sometimes through relocation, sometimes through methods the after-action reports described with careful euphemisms. The European Commonwealth's collapse had been accelerated by American intervention by special forces operations that eliminated stabilizing figures and arms deals that ensured conflicts would continue until every nation involved was too exhausted to resist American resource claims. The United Nations had dissolved, not with dramatic final sessions, but through gradual irrelevance, as member nations withdrew to focus on their own survival. The United Nations' last peacekeeping forces were American soldiers repainted in blue helmets deployed to secure strategic resources while maintaining the fiction of international cooperation. These troops described the surreal experience of conducting what were essentially colonial operations under the banner of an institution supposedly dedicated to peace and human rights. They guarded uranium mines and rare earth element extraction sites, watching local populations starve while shipping strategic materials back to American refineries and military production facilities. The cognitive dissonance broke some soldiers, but most simply compartmentalized, telling themselves that they were following orders, serving their country, doing what was necessary for American survival in a world where morality had become a luxury no nation could afford. The military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower had warned about decades earlier had metastasized by 2077 into something far beyond his darkest predictions. Defense contractors like West Tech and Robco operated with budgets that exceeded those of most nations, their boards of directors populated by retired generals and admirals who'd spent careers building relationships they now monetized. Congressional oversight had become theater hearings where politicians asked scripted questions and received carefully prepared answers, while the real decisions happened in closed-door meetings where classified programs were approved with budgets hidden in black line items. Procurement corruption was so pervasive that it was simply how business was done. Contractors inflated costs, military officers received consulting positions upon retirement, and the weapon systems that resulted were often inferior to what the official specifications promised. The fusion between corporate and military leadership had created officers who thought like businessmen and executives who wielded military authority. A general might sit on the board of the company producing armor for his divisions. A corporate vice president might hold reserve commission, giving him authority over research programs his company was contracted to complete. The checks and balances that might have prevented this corruption had been eroded by decades of emergency powers, acts, and classification protocols that shielded decisions from public scrutiny. Fort Strong's weapons programs were approved by committees where everyone involved had financial stakes in their success, and the testing protocols that might have revealed flaws were circumvented by officers who knew that their post-retirement careers depended on declaring programs successful regardless of reality. The classified project oversight that existed was more concerned with preventing leaks than ensuring safety or efficacy. Security clearances and need-to-know restrictions meant that dangerous programs could proceed without anyone having full visibility into their implications. The biological weapons research that occurred at multiple facilities was compartmentalized so thoroughly that scientists working on delivery systems didn't know what they were delivering, while those developing pathogens had no idea how they'd be deployed. This fragmentation prevented anyone from fully comprehending the arsenal of horrors being assembled, the weapons designed to destroy not just enemy soldiers but entire populations, to render territory uninhabitable, to make enemy civilians beg for death as relief from what had been inflicted upon them. October 23rd, 2077 began like any other day of elevated tension, another morning where DEFCON 2 meant the world balanced on the edge of annihilation. The launch sequences that followed remain disputed, whether China struck first or America, or if some third party triggered the exchange that would end civilization. What's documented is the mechanical precision with which the protocols were followed, how submarine commanders authenticated their orders and turned their keys, how intercontinental ballistic missile launch officers verified their codes and initiated sequences that would send missiles screaming from their silos. The bombers that were already aloft received their go codes and adjusted course toward targets they'd been rehearsing for years. On military bases across America and around the world, soldiers watched the mushroom clouds rise and understood that everything they'd been training for, all the weapons they'd developed and deployed, had led inevitably to this moment when humanity committed suicide and took most of the biosphere with it. The taste of ash and ozone would become familiar to those who survived in bunkers and vaults, but in those final minutes before the bombs arrived, soldiers manning defensive positions or conducting last-ditch operations against enemy forces tasted only fear and the metallic tang of adrenaline. Some followed their orders to the end, maintaining discipline even as the sky lit with nuclear fire. Others broke, deserting their posts to find family or simply to die somewhere other than their assigned duty station. The military chain of command fractured as communications failed and mushroom clouds bloomed across the continent, each detonation marking not just the destruction of a city, but the death of whatever illusions remained about honor duty or the righteousness of the cause for which so many had been sacrificed. If this story has kept you listening this far, and you want more of these dark confessions from the wasteland, hit that like button. It really motivates me to create similar Fallout lores. The power armor divisions that survived the initial nuclear exchange found themselves commanding technology that had become simultaneously more valuable and more useless than anyone could have imagined. In the immediate aftermath, when the electromagnetic pulses had fried most electronics and the firestorms had consumed whole cities, those sealed inside their armor survived conditions that killed unprotected humans in seconds. The suit's radiation shielding and environmental systems meant that soldiers could walk through fallout that measured lethal on every Geiger counter, could breathe filtered air, while the atmosphere itself burned with radioactive particles. But as the days became weeks, and the fusion cores began running dry with no supply chain left to replenish them, these walking tanks became coffins for soldiers who'd learned too late that invincibility has an expiration date measured in battery life. Some soldiers abandoned their armor when the cores failed, stripping out of the powered frames and facing the wasteland in whatever clothing they'd worn underneath. Others refused to leave their suits, dying inside them as life support failed and the temperatures soared or plummeted without climate control. Terminal entries found in power armor husks scattered across the Commonwealth tell stories of soldiers who understood they were dead but couldn't bring themselves to unseal their helmets, to face the reality of what the world had become. They stayed inside their metal shells, recording final messages to families who were almost certainly already dead, documenting the gradual failure of systems and the slower failure of hope. The smell of decay that eventually filled these suits attracted scavengers, both animal and human, who learned to crack open the armor like crab shells to get at whatever resources the corpse inside might still possess. The mechanized infantry that had supported power armor operations found their vehicles transformed from assets to liabilities in the post-war landscape. Tanks and armored personnel carriers required fuel that no longer existed, replacement parts from factories that had been vaporized, maintenance from supply chains that had burned with the rest of civilization. Some units tried to maintain operational status, cannibalizing disabled vehicles to keep a few running, but the mathematics of entropy were inescapable. A tank that ran on petroleum derivatives became a roadblock within days, then a shelter, then a tomb for whoever had tried to survive inside its armored shell. The soldiers who'd crewed these vehicles had to learn new skills rapidly: how to fight on foot, how to scavenge, how to kill without the overwhelming firepower advantage they'd taken for granted. Many didn't survive the transition from mechanized warfare to wasteland survival. Their training too specialized, their psychological dependence on technology too complete. The biological weapons programs that had seemed like such strategic advantages before the war became immediate threats in its aftermath. Fort Strong's laboratories had been developing pathogens designed to devastate enemy populations, while theoretically leaving infrastructure intact. Viruses that killed efficiently and then degraded in the environment after achieving their purpose. The bombs that struck the fort breached containment, releasing organisms that hadn't finished testing into a world with no hospitals, no antibiotics, no public health infrastructure to contain their spread. Survivors in the Boston area describe plagues that swept through refugee camps in those early months, diseases that presented symptoms no one had ever seen, that killed in ways that suggested intelligent design rather than natural evolution. The irony that America's biological weapons killed more Americans than they ever killed Chinese wasn't lost on the scientists who survived, though most of them had the decency to die of guilt or radiation before they could document it. The stealth suit programs that had been developed for special operations found unexpected utility in the post-apocalyptic wasteland, though not in the hands of military personnel. The technology had advanced far enough by 2077 that operators could achieve near invisibility through a combination of optical camouflage and radar-absorbent materials, becoming ghosts on the battlefield who could infiltrate enemy positions or conduct assassinations without detection. These suits required sophisticated power management and produced a distinctive shimmer when active that trained observers could spot, but in the chaos after the bombs, they became tools for a new kind of warfare. Raiders and scavengers who found working stealth suits became apex predators, able to approach settlements undetected and strike before anyone knew danger approached. The psychological terror of invisible enemies added another layer of horror to wasteland life, another reason to trust no one and suspect every shadow. The desertion execution squads that had hunted AWOL soldiers before the war found themselves without clear authority or purpose in the immediate aftermath, but some continued their mission with a fanaticism that suggested they'd internalize their orders beyond the point of questioning. Small groups of military police and provosts wandered the early wastelands, still wearing whatever remained of their uniforms, still executing anyone they deemed a deserter based on criteria that became increasingly arbitrary. They'd set up kangaroo courts in ruined buildings, conducting summary trials for crimes that no longer had meaning in a world where the military they'd served had ceased to exist. These execution squads eventually fell to wasteland predators, or other survivors who didn't appreciate their brand of old-world authority, but they lasted long enough to add their own atrocities to the catalog of horrors that defined the first years after the bombs. The checkpoint system that had been established during the martial law period before the war left infrastructure scattered across the Commonwealth that would shape post-war geography in unexpected ways. Fortified positions with concrete barriers and reinforced guard posts became natural defensive positions for survivor settlements, while the network of roads between checkpoints defined early trade routes through the wasteland. Terminals in these positions still contained duty rosters and incident reports documenting the gradual deterioration of civil order in the months before October 23rd. Soldiers had recorded confiscating food from starving civilians, shooting protesters who refused to disperse, enforcing quarantine zones around areas contaminated by industrial accidents that pre-war authorities had insisted were under control. The progression from peace officer to occupier to executioner was documented in bureaucratic language that somehow made the atrocities seem even more horrific. Each incident report, a small monument to how systems could transform ordinary people into monsters. The propaganda posters that the psychological warfare divisions had produced to maintain morale and support for the war effort still clung to ruined walls across the wasteland, their cheerful lies about American invincibility and the righteousness of the cause weathering slower than the civilization they'd helped destroy. These images of smiling soldiers in gleaming power armor, of happy families gathered around Vault-Tec displays of Uncle Sam pointing confidently toward a victorious future became cruel jokes in the irradiated ruins. But they also served as reminders of what the pre-war world had believed, or at least what it had tried to make people believe. The psychological warfare specialists had understood that controlling the narrative was as important as controlling the battlefield, that making people accept the unacceptable was just another form of weapons development. They'd crafted messages that made resource wars seem defensive, that made annexation seem liberation, that made the militarization of every aspect of society seem necessary and even noble. The continuity of government bunkers that the Enclave and other deep state elements had prepared became laboratories for a different kind of horror in the post-war years. These facilities had been stocked with supplies to last decades, equipped with technology that made them islands of pre-war capability in an ocean of devastation. But they'd also been staffed with people selected for absolute loyalty to an ideological vision of America that had always been more fantasy than reality, a vision that blamed weakness and contamination for civilization's collapse rather than acknowledging the military-industrial complex role in bringing about the apocalypse. The experiments that occurred in these bunkers, the plans developed for reclaiming the surface world, the decisions about who deserved to survive and who should be eliminated as genetically contaminated or ideologically impure, these would shape the wasteland's future as profoundly as the bombs themselves had shaped its present. The intercontinental ballistic missile silos that hadn't launched on October 23rd became strange monuments in the wasteland, vertical shafts reaching down into the earth where missiles still waited with warheads still armed. Some had suffered mechanical failures during the launch sequence, leaving them frozen at various stages of firing protocol. Others had never received authorization codes, their crews dead from the blasts or fallout before they could complete their mission. These sites attracted scavengers looking for technology and military hardware, but they also attracted something else, a kind of religious awe at the weapons that had destroyed the world, yet somehow failed to fulfill their complete purpose. Cults would form around some silos, worshipping the missiles as gods of destruction or demons, to be appeased, conducting rituals in the launch control bunkers while Geiger counters clicked their radiation hymns. The naval submarines that had been at sea when the bombs fell faced decisions that would have broken anyone's moral compass. Some captains, following their final orders, launched their missiles at targets that their sonar told them had already been destroyed. Others refused, unable to add to the apocalypse already in progress, and sailed their vessels to isolated coastlines where their crews might survive. A few submarines simply disappeared, either destroyed by enemy action, lost to mechanical failure, or perhaps sailing into the deep ocean to die away from the madness consuming the world. The submarine service's emphasis on psychological stability and following orders under extreme stress had prepared these sailors for nuclear war, but not for the reality of civilization's extinction, and the historical record suggests that many crews simply gave up opening their hatches and flooding their vessels rather than face a world that no longer had room for the kind of people they'd been trained to be. The West Tech contractors who developed the forced evolutionary virus and countless other programs that blurred the line between defense research and crimes against humanity found themselves facing unexpected consequences when the master later discovered their work and transformed it into something even they couldn't have imagined. The company's facilities had been scattered across America, each conducting research that fed into a larger program none of them fully understood due to compartmentalization and security protocols. The scientists who'd worked there had told themselves they were patriots, defenders of American security, innovators pushing the boundaries of what was possible. They'd ignored or rationalized the ethical implications of creating viruses that rewrote human DNA, of developing weapons that transformed people into monsters, of treating sentient beings as test subjects in experiments that would have been called torture if conducted by enemy nations. The karma they accumulated came due in the post-war world, though by then most of them were dead and unable to witness what their innovations had unleashed. The congressional funding mechanisms that had enabled the military-industrial complex excesses left paper trails that survived in surprisingly intact archives scattered across the wasteland. These documents revealed the scope of the corruption, the billions allocated to classified programs that produced weapons and technology that ultimately couldn't prevent civilization's collapse. Representatives and senators had traded votes and appropriations, each securing defense contracts for their districts while contributing to a military machine that consumed ever larger percentages of the national budget. The beautiful irony was that all their maneuvering, all the backroom deals and quid pro quo arrangements, all the careers built on securing military funding, none of it mattered when the bombs fell. The districts they'd served were vaporized, the voters they'd courted were ash, and the legacy they'd built was measured in megatons and body counts. The regular army personnel who hadn't been selected for special programs or power armor divisions, who'd simply served their time and followed their orders, left the most mundane and perhaps most tragic records in the wasteland's ruins. Their barracks held footlockers with family photos, and letters from home terminals contained emails worrying about bills and relationships, and holotapes recorded voices talking about plans for after their service ended, plans that died on October 23rd, along with most of the people making them. These were the soldiers who'd manned checkpoints and guarded supply depots, who'd deployed to occupation duty in Canada or riot suppression in Detroit, who'd done the unglamorous work of maintaining an empire in its death throes. They hadn't been promised glory or advanced technology, just steady pay and benefits in a world where economic collapse made any stable employment precious. They'd been used up and disposed of like every generation of soldiers before them, but at least previous generations had the cold comfort of dying for something. These last soldiers of the American military died for nothing except the final demonstration that war never changes, that the powerful will always sacrifice the powerless, and that the march toward annihilation continues until someone finally pushes the button. The smell of ozone that had hung in power armor maintenance bays, the metallic taste of recycled air in submarines, the acrid smoke from Fort Strong's furnaces, the sterile chemical scent of Cambridge polymer labs, all of it was swept away by the greater stench of burning. Civilization, of radiation and death, and the slow decay of everything humanity had built. The military organization that had seemed so powerful, so sophisticated, so capable of defending American interests and deterring enemy aggression had ultimately served only to ensure that when civilization fell, it fell completely and took most of the biosphere with it. The power armor divisions and nuclear submarines, the stealth suits and biological weapons, the psychological warfare and continuity of government plans, none of it prevented the apocalypse, and much of it accelerated the collapse it was theoretically designed to prevent. In the end, the pre-war United States military was a perfect expression of the civilization that created it, technologically advanced, morally bankrupt, bureaucratically complex, and utterly convinced of its own righteousness, even as it prepared the funeral pyre upon which humanity would burn. The soldiers who served in it were both victims and perpetrators, trapped in a system that demanded obedience while slowly eroding the values it claimed to defend. They followed their orders, maintained their discipline, executed their missions, and died wondering if any of it had mattered, if their service had meant anything beyond adding a few more bodies to the pile. The wasteland doesn't answer that question because the wasteland doesn't care. It simply exists, a monument to everything the military-industrial complex built, and everything it destroyed, a permanent reminder that war never changes, but perhaps someday humanity might.